So obviously what most people are wanting is to think about what they're hoping to look at here and how to best support children and young people with ASD manage all the anxieties and uncertainties through COVID. It is a very challenging time for lots of people, but especially people who like to have predictability. I think it's a very hard call for them, but also managing our own. And yes, absolutely. For us to manage anybody else's or to support them too, we need to be able to manage our own. I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Anita M. Hughes, who is a chartered educational psychologist. Anita has huge experience, many years experience of working with children who have been given these labels or these diagnoses, and many who haven't as well. And she's also written her book, Making Friends, which we'll tell you about later on. I'm just really delighted to invite you to kick off. Thanks so much, Anita.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome everybody. It's a very strange thing, really, talking into a computer rather than talking to a group of people, but marvellous that we can share something together from all over the country. That's absolutely fantastic. I'd like to give you this hour so that you can feel that you can relax. I mean, what timing, for goodness sake, to be giving a talk to you today about managing anxiety in uncertain times. And in many ways, the biggest trigger for anxiety is uncertainty. And so, my goodness me, we're not just having to work with children who've got anxiety, we're having to work with a whole nation of people with anxiety. I've worked for many, many years with children on the autism spectrum, at least 25. I've been a psychologist for 40 years, but it wasn't really until about 25 years ago that, first of all, the term Asperger's syndrome became popular, and then now we've got autism spectrum, and now we're talking about neurodiversity. But whatever we're talking about, it's the children who are awkward and find the world challenging and difficult because they don't fully understand it. And what I always say is that the underlying theme of all children with autism, of whatever, wherever they are on the spectrum, is that they are anxious. They're carrying anxiety with them. And I want to talk a bit about, I will be talking a bit about, obviously, a lot more about the children with autism, but I thought to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about, well, what do we mean by anxiety? Because anxiety gets a bit of a bad name, really. We're all trying to reduce anxiety, get rid of anxiety. Well, my feeling is that anxiety is a hugely important part of our lives. What drives us is our curiosity. And why I'm mentioning that is because the driving force of being people and human beings is being curious. We want to find out about things. And the more we find out about things and learn about things, the more interesting life becomes, more meaningful, there's more joy in our lives, and we feel we've got more control in our lives. And I'm wondering about all of you who've come today to listen to this talk. I guess part of it is curiosity, wondering, well, what is Anita going to say? I wonder what I'm going to find out today. And I hope you will learn some new things or have some things that you feel you know really confirmed and feel more confident about it. Well, when we're born into the world, babies born into the world, they are immediately curious about what is around them. And the babies develop in their early years, from day one, attachments with their mothers, fathers, and their primary caregivers, whether they're grandparents or other kind of caregivers. And in those early attachments, babies and young children learn that they can feel secure with things that are going to frighten them, that they've got, or new things or anything that's novel, that they can feel safe with their caregivers, and they can feel confident to explore out into the world. Now, Worth Publishing publishes many books about attachment, and I'm not talking about attachment today, but if you want to find out more about attachment, I can really recommend their books. But why I'm mentioning attachment theory, which was developed by John Bowlby, is because children on the autism spectrum often have those attachments disrupted, and so often have their ability to manage anxiety disrupted. And what I mean by this is that the when we talk about anxiety and curiosity, I and how we work out that balance, what I say is that what I feel about this is that for learning, we need to have a sort of a balance of anxiety and curiosity. Anxiety is our alert button. It's our safety net, really. And we want, you know, children are curious, we're curious, but unless we have that little bit of anxiety balancing things out, we could find ourselves unsafe. Now, with young, and the attachment thing is that, or the attachment that we make with people in our lives, the relationships we have with people in our lives, help us feel safe. Now, with children with autism, what many children with autism have is they're highly sensitive children. And so all the sensory information that comes in can feel far too much. And many parents tell me that their children who've subsequently been diagnosed with on the autism spectrum is that they were crying a lot, or they couldn't sleep. And a lot of the crying with these young children is that they couldn't explain that perhaps it was too noisy or too light, or perhaps they were being held too tight. And the children have sort of developed these almost defenses against too much coming in. And the too much coming in is creating the anxiety. And children with autism have developed all sorts of ways of managing their anxiety to feel on top of things and in control. And sort of an example of triggers of anxiety, as I said at the beginning, for most of us, it's generally just uncertainties. But to give you a couple of examples of children quite recently that I've been working with, I saw a little boy not very long ago with his mother, and he came to see me, and he relaxed in the session. He relaxed, and we were playing together, and then it was coming to the time to go. Well, transition is very difficult for a lot of children. Well, for all of us to some extent, it's always difficult to move from one thing to the other. But we eased him, we prepared him. He was going to be leaving quite soon, and he was going to go and get his coat, and then he was going to put his shoes on because he'd come in and he wasn't wearing shoes inside. And he suddenly had a huge meltdown. And a lot of people say, you know, with the children, that you're fine, and then suddenly he had a big meltdown. And he was screaming and screaming, and I didn't know what was upsetting him. And his mother quickly realized that it was his socks, and on his sock there was a little bobble. And you know how when fabric gets a bit old, or when socks get a bit old, little bobbles occur. And this little boy could not bear the bobbles, and he noticed a bobble on his sock. And his mother became quite agitated. Don't worry, we'll sort that out at home. But I could see that this little boy, it was just too much for him. And to cut a long story short, I was very patient. I said to his mum, don't worry, it's going to be all right. We'll get some scissors, we can cut it off. Only he insisted on cutting this little bobble off, but very quickly he cut the bobble off and he calmed down instantly. And then he went out and he was happy. And he was happy because we had acknowledged his anxiety at that moment, and his mum knew what it was. To give an example of another example of a child with anxiety, was that there was a boy I've been working with, a teenager, in a classroom. And there was a particular teacher that he had whom he found the voice of this teacher very disturbing, something about the tone of voice. Because for many youngsters on the autism spectrum, they're very sensitive to sound, and isn't always whether it's loud or not. It can be certain tones, and tones of voice can be interesting, because even only yesterday I was talking with a young girl who was talking about her mother. When she talks to her, it sounds to her as if she's shouting, and she's not really. Well, this teenage boy was having great trouble in his school, because for this particular class, he was in trouble all the time, because he kept almost sort of coming out with like a Tourette's comments. He was shouting out all the time. And the shouting out was him expressing an anxiety, because he found the teacher's voice very difficult. And he was getting in trouble, and he was getting detentions and all sorts of things, until the school and the parents got together and worked out, and he was able to say to his parents and say to the school, he found this teacher's voice difficult. And when they were able to acknowledge that, the teacher and the boy were able to work together better. Another story that I can tell you is that I was told only this week about another child that I have recently met, who was fine in shops in the summertime or the daytime, but when the parents took him last Christmas to do some Christmas shopping, and it was all bright lights, and he had a complete meltdown and they didn't know what it was really because there were too many lights, there were too many people, there was too much movement about. And it's these kind of unexpected things that can set children off, but they're not, the triggers can be all so varied. Another example is I've recently been working with an adult, because I do adult counselling as well as working with young children and teenagers. And this adult, a man, he's now 50, he's only recently been diagnosed with autism, and he wanted to try and make sense of his life and the difficulties and anxieties he's had in his life by talking with me and working with me. And one of the things he was telling me was that he was expelled from a school because he was considered to be continuously rude towards teachers. Now, this obviously is some time ago because he's now 50, but what he was telling me was that what he couldn't bear as a child, and he's had to learn to cope with it as an adult, was that he couldn't bear it if the teachers gave inaccuracies. You know, if they gave wrong information, or or interpreted things that he didn't think was the right way to be interpreted. And he felt he had to say something to the teacher, not to bring the teacher down, but because he had to say what he felt was the right thing. But of course, learning how to fit in society, we have to learn to let things go a bit. But for this chap, he was misunderstood as a child, and so for him, he just felt a bad person and didn't understand how he might have been bad. So these are just one or two different examples of how, for young people, for adults, for children on the autism spectrum, all sorts of things, different things can be triggers for anxiety, and it's how we can help them. And one of the big things of all is acknowledging that things are difficult. When we can see something is difficult, it's being able to say, I can see that's difficult for you. We might not fully, or we can understand that's difficult for you. And another huge thing that we need to do is to be able to be calm with children, to give them a feeling that they're being held. I mean, as the psychiatrist who contributed to the ideas of attachment theory, Winnicott, used to say years ago, to be held. It's like emotionally held. And by that, it's feeling that the person you're with, the adult you're with, can take your anxiety. They're not going to be thrown by it. But of course, that means that we need to be able, as Andrea was saying at the beginning, we as adults need to be able to manage our own anxiety. And in a way, that's where we need to start, is looking at how we manage our own anxieties. And at this point, I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to ask you to sort of involve you. And I think Andrea or Lucy are going to put up the questions right now.
Yes, I'm sure that Anita will be specifically referring to COVID in a moment. I think we've started from the general and we'll come to the specific with COVID a little bit later on. Well, we can definitely see what the key thing is, can't we? Look at this.
I can see there's workload, there's family circumstances, there's illnesses, there's not knowing quite what's happening, it's visits, too much work.
Yeah.
The problems of wearing masks, all sorts of things.
Yes. I saw one going past that really touched me, actually, that said, not sure I'm doing the right thing. I think that must be a huge concern for so many people right now. Not seeing family. Yes, there's so much separation around, isn't there, which creates so much stress for so many of us.
Worrying about one's own mortality. Well, of course, worrying about your family illnesses and stress in the workload and
Yeah, lack of support back on there.
And even
Okay.
even lack of daylight. We're heading into this time of year where the days are so much shorter, aren't they? And
We are.
yeah.
Set
And
this
thank you for sharing this, because other people, you'll all be knowing that you're feeling the same sorts of things. Let's go to the next question, because to follow on from this. So what I'm seeing here is what has helped you to manage that anxiety, and I'm hearing keeping in touch with the family, mindfulness, talking, having some routine and predictability, meditation, yes, routine exercise, supervision with peers and talking with friends, long walks, getting some fresh air, absolutely. Walking in the woods, doing yoga, running, yes, that's also good. Knowing the rules, setting up a routine, being outdoors, a lot about outdoors, doing yoga, fresh air, talking with friends, analysts, husband, taking time and speaking to people, going through the same, sleep and diet, yes, Zoom calls with friends, of course, that's a marvelous way to keep in touch, supervision, walking, daily texts, having some fresh air, sleep, time and space, having some time and space, petting the dog, that's great, swimming, I like that, doing, going out with your horse and dog, having a routine. We can manage our anxieties in these ways, the support of a friend. It's all these things are just so important.
And medication, recognizing that sometimes some of us will need to do that some of the time. Absolutely.
That's right.
Sometimes
yes.
that's a support,
and
isn't it?
Seeking out help. It's finding one's own way. Some of these things that people are describing are doing things for yourself, maybe going out for a walk by yourself, but other things are going to be doing with other people, or just taking out speaking with people doing the same thing. So thank you for those. That's really, really good. Well, now I was thinking about these responses that you've been giving me, because I was coming up with really 7 main points that I think help with managing anxiety. And it's looking for ourselves, as you've all given your ideas about how you're managing your anxiety. I'm certainly managing my anxiety in the same sorts of ways as you, talking with friends, going for walks, doing yoga, these sort of things are the things that I like to do, because I'd like to give some examples of how you can support children on the autism spectrum with some of these things. So the first one is quite a lot of wording here, but I'm writing here is to feel secure in a relationship with someone you trust, who cares about you, believes in you, and gives you sympathetic understanding. But for a child, this might be a parent, another adult family member, a teacher, a football coach, a youth worker, and so on. But children need to feel that they are, they've got somebody that they can talk to about their worries, or to feel just safe with. And when Andrea mentioned my book at the beginning called Making Friends, a big bit of my work, and I've written about it in this book, is running groups for children. And in my groups for children, this is where the children can feel secure in a group to share their worries and anxieties, facilitated by myself and my colleague. And it's been so important that they feel that they have this safe place. And that's what they often talk about, how they feel that it's a safe place. So the next one is to receive patient and non-intrusive support. It's this feeling of patience and non-intrusion. Sometimes we can jump in and want to give advice to people, whether it's we're talking about ourselves, our families, or whatever, but we need to feel ready to have the advice, and it's just being patient and supportive and being there. Number 3 is to be told in a reassuring way what is happening and what is going to happen. Now, for children on the autism spectrum who really like to know what's going to happen because they feel very unsafe and that they don't know what's going to happen, one of the ways that a lot of people have used over the past few years is through social stories. Carol Gray wrote a book some years ago called I think it's called My Social Stories Book. And but if you Google social stories, you get lots of links, because that's a way that you can help children through pictures, making like a little picture story about normal routines of the day, or it could be routines in the school day. And in fact, I was working with a family quite recently where a little boy who's only 6 is having great difficulty getting into school, but also great difficulty moving from one thing to another in his own home life. He doesn't want to go and start a meal. He doesn't want to go out for a walk. And so I said to the parents, suggested about the social stories, and we decided to call it comic strips. And this little boy loved it when his dad drew pictures of himself and as dad and his son. And so he created comic strips of the day. And that was a way, in a visual way, because children who are autistic so respond to the visual of what was happening, what's going to happen. The next point is to notice areas in your life where you do feel in control. I think sometimes when we get overwhelmed by anxiety, whether you're autistic, whether anybody, any child, it's where we feel out of control. I think a lot of the trouble of what's going on in these COVID times, I mean, that was a big thing that was coming up on what's making us all feeling so anxious now, is lots of elements around the COVID. It's anxiety is about, might I get the virus? Might somebody else get the virus? Might I be somebody who gives somebody else the virus? There's all the uncertainties about, will we be having a lockdown? Yes, we're now in another lockdown. What does that mean? Will I lose my job? Will my children be able to go to childcare? What's going to happen at Christmas? And all these sort of things we feel out of control of at the moment. So it's looking at where we do feel in control. What are the things that we do like doing, that we do feel comforted by? And going for a walk. I mean, nature, if you can get out and go for a walk, nature is there for us, and that kind of thing. The next point is the number 5, developing resilience and being able to come back after setbacks. Hugely important in managing anxiety. And I've got a little story I shall tell you. I think I've got time before we finish this little part of the session, but last year, a teenage girl in one of my groups really wanted to be in a school production. And she wanted to audition for a male part, because she felt this would suit her very well. And the school just said, no, you can't do that. And she came to us in our group, the friendly group, this group I was referring to earlier, these groups I work with, and she told the group how disappointed she was because she wasn't even being given a chance to audition, because she wanted to audition for a male part. And the group supported her and say, well, go back to the school, explain a bit more. And we talked through how she could speak to the teachers and how she could tell them why she thought she could be good in this part. And not only was she then given the opportunity to audition, but in actual fact, she then got the role, and she did fantastically. And thank goodness it was last year before the COVID times. But it was brilliant because she came back to the group and was able to tell them that she'd gone back to her teachers and talked in a way that was calm, because she had been given that support. And that really developed her resilience, because she didn't get put off by that setback. And I just wanted to share that with you as a little example. The next thing, number 6, for managing anxiety, is to notice the activities that you enjoy and which calm you, and do more of them. Now, I've put some examples like knitting, running, walking, singing, reading, gardening, and all these things can be considered as meditative, because meditation is a key component in anxiety management. For children, if it's good to ask them, to be noticing, helping them to notice what do they enjoy and do more of. And working with my groups, they've said things like their pets are a great comfort to them. A lot of them like going out and walking, riding their bikes, listening to music, playing with Lego, playing on their computer games. And it's helping the children to notice what they enjoy doing, because sometimes I think we can be doing things that are comforting for us and helping us, but not realizing that that's what's happening, and being able to do more of it. Much better to do more of what is giving us good health or good mental health or helping us feel better, than trying to avoid the things that create anxiety for us. And the last point, as I wanted to mention, that is really important in managing anxiety is to love the world rather than fear the world. And I think we really are in such difficult times because the whole narrative at the moment is really about fear. And I feel that really it adds to the anxieties for all of us. And I know when it was the first lockdown, one of the things that gave me great heart was actually there were lots of stories, and I hope it's going to happen again, where people showed compassion to one another. They reached out to people who were isolated. There were people who were enjoying nature, really appreciating what was out, you know, the natural world, appreciating the relationships they've got with others, appreciating actually that we've got the technology that we can connect with our family members, that today, for example, that we can all connect together. And I think that the more that the children on the autism spectrum experience these feelings that there are things to love and enjoy, it's not children on the spectrum alone or adults on the spectrum alone. It's for all of us to be loving rather than fearing is a huge way forward. And just to conclude, before we go into the question and answers part of this session, a client of mine who is, she was a parent of a friendly group child many years ago, and her child is grown up now, but she comes to see me for support. And she's a senior clinician in the health service. And she was diagnosed a few years as autistic, and she suffers from huge anxiety. And she came to see me the other day and was 10 minutes late. And she arrived and she said, "Do you know, Anita, I used to get so anxious about being late. And I've just decided there is so much happening in the world right now. I've just got to accept it. And I've decided acceptance is the way forward." And this was the words of an autistic lady. So I felt that's fantastic. And in some ways, we've got to somehow find a way to accept what's going on around us at the moment.
What would be helpful is if you could perhaps talk about some of the anxieties that parents and carers are generally expressing to you at the moment through COVID, and how you've worked with those.
Interestingly enough, when there was the first lockdown and everybody was at home, many parents reported that the children were actually far more relaxed. In a funny sort of way, these times have been quite good for the youngsters, and for the youngsters who haven't been at school for a while, they've almost had a chance to relax a bit more and reboot themselves. And even going back to school, what's been very interesting is that the schools, because they've had to be more organized, more structured, for the children, they are finding that it's better at school than it used to be, because it's not so it seems to be more organized for them and less chaotic. And parents have been finding that the way that one of the big problems actually that a lot of parents have talked about, and how they've been able to support their children, has been some of them haven't wanted to come out of their bedrooms. The teenagers wanted to get cooped up in their bedrooms, and so parents were having to coax them out to go outside. And of course, earlier on we had such marvelous weather, and where parents were able to coax children out, even if it was just in the garden, or finding games to play, board games to play, getting out and about and being sort of doing all old-fashioned family activities, the whole families were finding they were all more relaxed together. And actually that was really what was helping a lot with the anxieties. It was having family activities together, being together. But obviously there were other families where the stresses were greater. And actually then there were difficulties, and where people have sought help outside, you know, whether parents or carers have sought out the carers for supervision, or for parents to seek help from their own counsellors or other friends and family. It's really been talking to others that's helped people most of all.
Lovely. Thank you. There's a question here that says, do you think there's a connection between sensitive children and a lack of early paternal involvement, for example, physical handling and cuddles?
I've not ever read anything like that. I'm not sure that that necessarily would be a direct connection. I think that there's more that the very sensitive children, especially those with physical, sensory sensitivity to touch, might have found touch too much and have pushed people away. And so have, if you like, given off the vibes, I don't want to be touched, to keep away, and perhaps then parents have kept more away because the children are giving that information. I've never read any connection, and I wouldn't want to sort of make up that as a connection.
No, for sure. There's another
Yes.
question here about parents perhaps worrying that the children are going out and getting infected. And I wondered if your children and young people in your groups have talked about any worries around not being able to control whether they get infected or whether they might pass it on, but also how you've worked with that anxiety if they have expressed it.
Yes. Well, of course, that's an interesting question, because of course for several months they weren't at school, they weren't out and about mixing with other people. And you see, it's interesting because youngsters on the autism spectrum are as wide and varied as the population. And what I found with the youngsters I'm working with, there are some who really are not worried at all about giving it the virus to anybody else. It hasn't really occurred to them, because I suppose they're more just thinking, they're more sort of thinking about themselves and are not thinking about the bigger picture. And yet there are other youngsters who have been worried about not wanting to see their grandparents because they didn't want to give the virus to their grandparents. So the children are as varied as the population. And when I've worked with my groups, it's as much as anything, we all talk about and share our different perspectives and respect our different perspectives and respect that there are dangers around, and we need to be careful and with the risks and taking care, and the fact we do have a responsibility to think about other people. And I think we've talked more about sort of thinking about others, but I've been surprised actually with the youngsters I've been directly working with that so few of them have been, well, I would have expected them to be more anxious about the virus than they have been. And it's been sort of, I've been pleasantly surprised really.
Someone says here, my son loved the first lockdown, no school, lots of home and mummy time. I wasn't finding it so easy, with which I think a lot of people could probably sympathise.
I really have to say that my heart went out to families, because doing the homeschooling and parents who were probably trying to work from home as well, that was a huge challenge. And I think that there's been a lot of parents feeling very guilty about not doing enough to be helping their children, or worrying about how it would be, for their progress in education and everything like that. But I think there's been a lot of children who have absolutely loved the lockdown, because they've been able to play games. I know that some youngsters have sort of rushed through their schoolwork, whatever the online schoolwork was, and then spent the rest of the day playing computer games or messing about outside, or just doing their own thing, and rather enjoying that in a way, having that control over their day, if you like. So yes, that's interesting.
And now somebody has put an interesting thing here about there being anxiety about death, a lot of anxiety about death. And I know actually that you've had some experience in the friendly group where somebody had an illness, didn't they, some time back. I wonder if you'd like to talk just briefly, because there may be other things coming in, and I'm aware of time passing super fast as it always does. Could you just briefly refer to that experience you had where there was an anxiety about death in the group, and how you worked with that in the here and now?
Well, in the friendly group a few years ago, there was a boy diagnosed with bone cancer, and he had to have treatment for the best part of a year, and was in hospital for a lot of the time, and wasn't able to go to school. And I wrote a lot about this particular case, and the parents were very happy for me to do so, and so was the boy, who I'm pleased to say did recover eventually from his bone cancer. And I wrote about this in my book, and in fact the book that I've written, Making Friends, is full of stories of how children have managed anxieties and how we've worked in the group with the children talking about their fears. And in that situation with that boy, it's very interesting how the children didn't directly talk about, well, they did talk about death, and because a lot of autistic children can be very matter of fact about things, they feel more comfortable if things are talked about rather than not talked about. So when they were talking about the cancer, they were wanting to share with each other details about how cancer cells multiply and how that eventually might kill you, and how was this boy getting on, and the boy was talking about the treatments he was having. And what's interesting is ultimately this boy has developed the desire to go into work, not necessarily surgical work, but what fascinated him, and I won't go into great details, but he had to have had to have a whole part of his leg removed, the bone I should say, and had this artificial bone put in that then had to be, of course, extended as he was growing. And he got very interested for his future of working in that kind of field. But what I found is that the children can be quite, if they're allowed to talk about what really worries them, about things like dying, and they're with adults who can take it, who can listen, who can say, yes, it is a worry. And I know that there have been children in the friendly group who have lost grandparents earlier on this year through COVID, and they were able to talk about it in a very matter-of-fact way. But I haven't had any children talk about losing or fearing losing their own parents or brothers or sisters, so their own age group. And if you like, youngsters can more uneasily be very upset by, but accept death of an older person because that's the sort of natural order, even if it's very, very upsetting.
And thank you for that. There's also a comment here from somebody who said that she's working with a young person whose grandma died. She was already highly anxious. Her anxiety is through the roof, so much to cope with. So there's an agreement been set up where she can leave the class if things are too overwhelming. She just wants to be alone in the dark and uninterrupted at certain times. So I'm guessing with a situation like that, where the anxieties are so high, that having those agreements in place, and also having adults who really understand you and know you and accept these different things, but also keep an eye on that situations, because being alone in the dark uninterrupted is obviously quite worrying for people.
But interesting and marvellous that the person who's has given this in is saying that they're listening to that young person who needs to have that bit of space in the dark that's quiet. And what I would also say, I don't know how much grief counselling she's being offered, but if she's able to have the opportunity to talk about her memories of her grandma, to talk about the things that she really enjoyed and loved about her grandma, because what she needs to hold on to is the memories of her grandma being alive, because that is a really, really helpful way of processing the grief of the loss, because the loss of the person is there, but the memories and the love that grandma gave will always be there, and it's for her to have that experience to know that.
Absolutely. And there are some great books out there for helping children and young. I always think of the one by Michael Rosen about his son who died. Is a beautiful book for a slightly older child about working through grief, but there are some wonderful books out there.
And for younger children, there's the marvellous children's book called Badger's Parting Gifts.
Yes, and Grandpa. There are quite a lot of those lovely books, aren't there? Beautiful things.
That's right.
And somebody else has talked about challenges in supporting families with young people who have a lot of worries around keeping their hands clean. So that's interesting, isn't it? If it begins to become, what can I control? Well, I can control how clean my hands are. So if the anxiety is being channeled into that. And the strategy that's been offered here is we've been trying to link with sensory soothing activities that can include hand washing to deal with it, but without overdoing it and ending up with dry, cracked hands. And thank you so much for that. I'm sitting here as someone who is never far from her moisturizer bottle at the moment, but that sounds like an important way, Anita, to both accept the anxiety, accept that there's an increased wish to it, but to do it in a safe way, a bit like modifying self-harm.
Yes. What's interesting, of course, is that hand washing is a very common expression of anxiety of children on the autism spectrum, or other children. But I've noticed quite a lot of youngsters over the years, there's been a problem with the hand washing. And in a funny kind of way, currently, because everywhere you go, you've got to hand sanitize, I think what I've noticed is some of those anxieties have reduced because they're already having to hand sanitize around. So somehow there are some, when I say benefits, I'm discovering that some of the sort of, if you like, the OCD, the obsessive behaviours like hand washing seem to be reducing because we're paying more attention to cleanliness and our health. So it's got, there's some there's some positives out of all this negative in a funny sort of way.
Yes. Somebody has said that they're working with families where the families are worried about the children, but the children are going, no, we're fine. So it is interesting, isn't it? And I suppose that thing about if you have a cohort of children who actually really like structure and rules and so forth, and they like things to be quieter, then actually some of this may work for them. On the other hand, as you say, the children and the young people that people are working with are going to be across the spectrum of behaviours and human experiences to like all cohorts of children.
And what I would say is that anxiety, I'll just say one little extra, is anxiety is catching, and also calmness is catching. And I think the thing is that if you've got a family, like you're saying, parents might be anxious and the children are saying it's fine, somehow or other, the parents have got to pick up on the children saying it's fine, because otherwise they're going to pick up on their parents' anxieties, or the vice versa. So if we're able to sort of, go along as much as we can with the ones in our family or friendship circle or teachers or school setups who are the calm ones, you can almost like let their calmness rub off on me.
And so supporting the parents and the carers it's a bit like Russian dolls. I always think of Russian dolls, if the people here in this webinar are also there to support parents and carers to be calm, to support the children. We're not supporting the children to calm the parents down, but we're nonetheless working with both groups really. What about when the children won't talk? And I don't know about this lass who needs to go to a darkened room, but there will be some children who don't feel capable of articulating their feelings, and they may act it out, or they may demonstrate it through other behaviours. How do you work with those within the friendly group, for example?
Well, within the friendly group, or when I'm doing my individual counselling work, it's just acknowledging, I can see that's difficult for you. It's giving the voice for the child that can't speak. I understand that must be difficult. And it's giving an acknowledgement that you can see that something is difficult for them. And something that happened this week was I had a parent contact me because her son got very, very anxious, teenage boy. He was in his bedroom. He was refusing to speak, refusing to eat, and refusing to drink. What do? I got this email through, and I said, well, what I suggest you do is you just put a drink of water and some food outside his bedroom door, say in as calm a voice as you can, there's some food and drink out there. I'm not going to trouble you. When you're ready to come out and see us, that's fine. We're going to be downstairs, and that's absolutely fine. And it took many, many, many hours. And I think that mother had to bear her own anxieties and to not interrupt. But he did eat and drink. And the next day, I'm not saying things were absolutely perfect, but he did come out and he did start, doing the normal things again. And I think it's kind of being, it's holding on to the fact that youngsters don't always want to talk, and they don't always want you to be talking either. But it's being able to acknowledge and say, I can see that's difficult, and I know it's difficult, and there aren't always answers, but I'm here for you, or I understand. And those are hugely empowering all round. And that's what I would say, really.
Okay, one last question. So it says we need to try and help reframe they won't talk to they struggle to talk. Absolutely. And so yes.
And it's saying it's difficult to talk, and it's difficult to say how you feel, and that's all right. I think it's also to say, and that's all right. It's all right if you can't say how you feel. And it's also giving children the language of feelings. I can see that you're feeling really unhappy, or I can see you're feeling very frustrated. And it's okay. It's not nice having those feelings, but it is okay, because, we all have those feelings. It's that kind of language and narrative.
Yes. And there is one final question. So do you have any suggestions for supporting parents who are going through their own autism diagnosis, and how to support the family as a whole? I know you've had this experience, Anita, so just really like a couple of lines, I'm afraid, on that. Thank you.
Well, I would really recommend seeking out somebody to talk with about the diagnosis. It could be, I mean, I'm seeing more and more adults who've recently been diagnosed as a counsellor, an adult counsellor, and it doesn't even matter if the person is not an expert, if you like, in autism. I think it's just being able to have a chance to talk through what that feels like for you. And also the National Autistic Society is a marvellous organisation. And when I first became sort of involved with the National Autistic Society, I'm not running it or anything like that, but being part of the organisation, it was mainly about children. But now more and more there are branches all over the country, and they are fantastic for adult support as well as child support. So I would say look at the National Autistic Society.
And somebody says a lovely thing here about about feelings and being able to acknowledge them. Name it to tame it, as Dan Siegel says, which is a lovely thing to end on. I love that. Yes, and it's not trying to push it away. It's just saying, yeah, that's the reality of how it is right now. It's tough, yeah, and I'm still here, and it is tough right now. And I think that word right, those right words right now are very helpful, because they give a subliminal message of it won't always be like this.
That's right.
But it's tough right now. I can see that it's tough right now. So what do you think we need? I mean, in my case, it would always be, would you like a cup of tea? But I appreciate that's probably not the case for everybody. But nonetheless, but that right now-ishness, I think, is important, isn't it? Because it always comes back to what I think about with you, Anita, which I'd like to stay in the present moment. So if you wish to buy Anita's book, then there's a 25% discount offer for you, which is with Worth Publishing, which obviously is the publishing company that has published Anita's book, and that's orders at worthpublishing.com. Those amazing pictures that came up in the polls, and I don't know about you, Anita, but I felt really heartened, because the range of difficulties that were there for people are enormous, but I was also so touched by the resilience that people are showing, and all of those things that people were saying fit into the New Economics Foundation did a massive meta survey of all the different ways of supporting well-being, taken from vast cohorts of research. They did a meta-analysis, and it comes down to the 5 basic things around get active and take notice and have exercise and all this sort of thing. There's 5 core things. All the different things that you were saying and learn came into those, which is really marvelous. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for being with us this afternoon. Anita, thank you so much. It's been great as ever with you. The time just whizzes past. I cannot believe that was an hour. so helpful. So thank you very much indeed.
And I would just finally like to say, what has been lovely is, although I haven't seen you all in person, I have really had a feeling of you all there, and fabulous that you joined in, and it's really given us, we're all in it together, and whether you've got an autism diagnosis or not, we're all people together, and I think that it's fantastic that you're all doing all this good work.
Yes,
thank you, Andrea, so much for inviting me today.
But please take care, guys. Keep yourselves safe. And I read this lovely thing that says, stay positive and test negative. And we hope you do.